welcome honoured guests, OR's family members, colleagues and students. We're privileged indeed to have with us this afternoon an outstanding example of an old boy of this school. The Right Honourable Andrew Smith is here this afternoon to talk to you about a life in politics, to share some of his experiences, which I hope may shape your reflections on the purpose of your future careers and the value of the things you are learning even now. Andrew was at Reading School 1962 to 1968, just the twinkling of an eye ago. He went on to Oxford to read at St John's, where he was the recipient of the Sir Thomas White Scholarship. We still give thanks every year in our commemoration service for Sir Thomas White and that scholarship. After Oxford, where he completed a BA and MPhil, he was a councillor in Oxford for 11 years and then was elected MP in Oxford East in 1987. He was Minister for Employment and Disability Rights, Chief Secretary of the Treasury from 1999 to 2002, and in 2002 became Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. He was a Member of Parliament for 30 years, and I imagine has an awful lot of stories. He is most remembered, and Andrew, this is harvested from a wide range of websites. He is most remembered for some of the following things. And if for nothing else, gentlemen, I believe this means he has earned your ears. He's most remembered for campaigning for the rights of Gurkhas and their families to stay and to work in the UK. For consistently campaigning against child poverty. For helping to introduce the New Deal, which sought to tackle the problems of long-term unemployment. For introducing pension credit systems and pension protection funds. For working towards achieving rights in the workplace for the disabled. We say often to you, there's not much point us educating you, supporting you, nurturing your talent if you don't use it for good. And it's therefore a great privilege to welcome to Big School this afternoon someone who not only sat where you have sat, who not only shares some of the aspirations that you have shared, but has also spent his life doing that which is good for others. May I ask you to give a round of applause for the Right Honourable Andrew Smith.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Walking up those steps, I felt the same awe as I did some 62 years ago on arriving here at Reading School. This is an excellent school. Is that sound working all right? It's echoing a bit, isn't it? This is an excellent school, and everyone carrying forward its work, it's nearly 900 years of work, should be very proud of what you do. And it's a particular honour to speak this afternoon in the memory of Frank Terry, a great teacher with an extraordinary talent for bringing out the best in pupils, and I owe him a lot, as do many others. Now, in sharing with you some of my thoughts on politics, I'm going to concentrate on domestic policy. It'll be pretty evident I've still got the Treasury chip in my brain, I'm afraid. And I've tried to pick out things that might not be too evident, but if you want to ask me about anything else political in questions afterwards, please do so. And let me stress at the outset that whilst much I have to say is about the need for change and improvement, the UK starts with a huge number of positives. The generally caring and tolerant nature of our society, the spectacular achievements of our sciences and arts, the relative absence of corruption in public service and politics, our flexible labour market, the global competitiveness of London as a financial centre, and the general stability and cohesion of our national life across the generations. What's more, the overwhelming majority of people who go into politics in the UK do so for honourable reasons. Even if the ferocity of political competition and the temptations of office lead some astray, the majority remain decent people trying to do a difficult job well. And it can be a dangerous job too. 2 of my former MP colleagues were murdered, and several, myself included, saw potential assailants sentenced to prison for threatening to murder. Don't let that put you off. The pressures of public life in the glare of 24-hour news and social media can be considerable. But the rewards of politics, in terms of the opportunity to be of service, the chance to make a difference, and to have an interesting life, are very considerable too. And I hope some of you will in time consider it. And if you do, if you want any advice, then please let me know. But we have to face the fact that the standing in public opinion of politicians in general and MPs in particular is not the best. Things like the expenses scandal and the freebies in particular are part of it, and it all has to stop. Moreover, there is a widespread feeling that the political establishment and related areas of the media and public and business administration are an out-of-touch elite, ignorant of the lives and not sharing the values of much of the populace. Not only in this country, but across Europe and the United States, we have seen this fueling populist alternatives to the established parties, and how far this is the democratic system correcting things, or how far it is a route to a fantasy politics which will end in catastrophe, remains to be seen. The attacks on opponents in the US election as fascists or communists were as inflammatory as they were inaccurate. It's important, therefore, to rescue our politics from public disillusion while safeguarding and strengthening the principles of democracy. One part of that has to do with effective representation, and another with effective governance, and I will say a bit about each. In representing people, trust really matters. It is a bond between the elected and the electorate. I often expressed it as on your side. It means people having confidence that you will act in their interests. It's an emotional as much as an analytic thing. And let me, in the context of trust, pay tribute to my friend and colleague, the late John Prescott, former Deputy Prime Minister, who we learnt has sadly died. He exemplified commitment to public service. He was an extraordinary character, a larger-than-life person, pugnacious but also a peacemaker, and he left an enduring and valuable legacy to our country. Now, former New York Governor Mario Cuomo famously said, "You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose." That adage imparts an important truth, but not the whole truth. I say that because a campaign which doesn't have its metrics, its organisation and its command structure will lose, however inspiring its rhetoric. And equally, any government can be as rationally and as effectively managed as you like, but if it lacks the ability to communicate how it feels to be on its journey, it will not keep people on side. They will start listening to the poetry of the opposition. I think in general, though, that the rationality side of politics, bullet point lists of policies, all of that, is better understood than the emotional side. And if anyone here wants to understand how emotion works in politics, I recommend a book. It's old now but still relevant, The Political Brain by Drew Weston. A psychologist and a democratic supporter, he explained why progressives are so often beaten by the right, even when they think they're going to win. And it basically comes down to whether the candidates and their policies resonate emotionally with the electorate. And Trump understood this, And even though he had his felony and most of the media against him, he won, in the end, quite easily, partly because a lot of voters actually felt an emotional accord with his having so much of the media and the commentators against him. Crucially, he radiated strength against many of the things Americans feared or had experienced to their cost: precarious living standards, crime in their communities, and the risk of biologically male sports players beating up their daughters on the playing field. It didn't matter how decent or joyful Harris was, she wasn't connecting, except for some, a minority, on the question of abortion. But given a hospital pass by Biden's late forced withdrawal, she neither passionately defended his record nor offered any real alternative. Even though she was given, on the whole, a very favourable hearing by the American media. Now, dealing with the media in politics or in other areas as well can be difficult. The influential and controversial Conservative politician Enoch Powell famously said, "For a politician to complain about the press is like a ship's captain complaining about the sea." He was right, but dealing with the media can be demeaning and even an exhausting task. In the world of 24-hour news, with a complicit public eager to get its news fix, how it generally works is that those who feed the monster get rewarded and those who hold back get punished. It took me a long while to learn that, but I am proud I never briefed against a colleague or against our party. A remarkable thing about Trump's victory is that he was able to take on so much of the establishment media, the fake news as he would say, and we as observers have a right to ask, how come they all got it so wrong? The pollsters who seem to be correcting their results so as not to get the normal statistical spread you would expect, the reporters who didn't pick up the sophistication of the Republican ground game, who overplayed each and every wayward comment at a Trump rally, whilst missing the real and ultimately crucial demographic shifts in electoral support, a bigger proportion of women voting for Trump than last time for Biden, more Hispanics, more black people, more young people, more actually of just about everybody. The explosion of online news, social media and podcasts means that these days we choose our own news to a much greater extent than when everyone watched the same TV programmes. And this fragmentation of shared public experience is a challenge to the objectivity of the established media. So I would just say that when you watch or see or listen to any news, look out for the spin on the selection and presentation of what are considered newsworthy items. Coming back to emotion in politics, a key discipline is not to let the feelings of the moment distort your judgment. The best leaders I've seen can compartmentalise incredibly. They don't allow feelings and thoughts about one situation to spill over into another. They give their all to one issue at a time. And the best example I can remember concerns Tony Blair. As you heard, during his first government, I was the minister in charge of the New Deal for the young and long-term unemployed. And with the then Secretary of State David Blunkett, I went to report on progress to the Prime Minister. As we entered Downing Street, a huge throng of the world's media were opposite that famous door. The speculation was that NATO was about to start bombing Serbia. Our meeting was delayed because the Prime Minister was having a phone conference with then President Bill Clinton. After some time, Tony joined us in the cabinet room and we said to him, look, we realise you're dealing with some really tough issues at the moment. We can, of course, go away and come back some other time to give our report. And he said, no, that's okay. I'm sorry I was detained, but we can crack on now. So we gave our presentation, and for 40 minutes, Prime Minister asked searching questions, made suggestions. He was completely focused on the New Deal. Then when we'd finished, he got up and without a pause walked down the short corridor to the front door of number 10 and stepped straight out to face the TV cameras and make his statement. Now, I think most of us having to do that would have been thinking about this during the meeting. We'd have at least wanted a few moments to collect our thoughts. But Tony Blair went directly from concentrating on youth unemployment to concentrating on international military action. It was, and he set out his position, of course, with his customary flair. Now, Tony Blair was a great Prime Minister, an interesting character. He made some important reforms, but it can be argued that he wasn't able to reform enough, and I think he might think that as well. Amongst the reforms which I have come to believe are necessary is electoral reform. I began to think of it in these terms. The Labour Party at its best is about fairness, and nothing is more important in a democracy than that votes count fairly. It's why Lyndon Johnson's 1965 Voting Rights Act in the United States was such a crucial culmination of the American civil rights movement that Martin Luther King wept as he heard LBJ proposing that act to Congress. Now, when you have two parties which are overwhelmingly supported, as was the case in the UK for much of the 1950s and 60s, the system doesn't really make too much difference. But now, the discrepancies between shares of the vote and shares of the seats is indefensible. In the general election of the 4th of July, Labour, with just 33.7% of the vote, won 412 seats, or 63% of the total. Reform and the Green Party between them got 22% of the total vote, but just 9 seats, 1.3% of the total. And I defy anybody to justify that as fair. Or another way of looking at it, you could say, is that Labour won a huge, nearly 2/3 share of the parliamentary seats, but nearly 2/3 of the British population not only didn't want a Labour government with a huge majority, they didn't want a Labour government at all. Now, to be fair to my fellow Labour members, most of them realise this is unfair, and Labour Party conference resolutions favour electoral reform. Many Labour MPs and councillors, though, do not, being happy to take their chances with the present capricious system. But they do risk being hoisted by their own petard, in that quite a small swing away from Labour next time could see us lose an awful lot of seats. The argument against reform is that the present system is well understood, it delivers strong governments, and it avoids messy and unstable coalitions. I would counter that people are perfectly capable of understanding a different system, they do so all over the world. What's more, the present system might deliver strong majorities, but it does not always deliver strong mandates in the sense of electoral support for the direction of policy. Other aspects of our constitution are overdue for reform. The unelected House of Lords is indefensible on democratic grounds, and that, along with Iran, we are one of the few countries in the world to have members of our legislature selected on the basis of religion, is at best an anachronism and at worst an outrage. There is the additional inconsistency of our partial devolution in the UK, in that laws within the competence of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly do not have to go through the unelected House of Lords, whereas equivalent laws affecting England do have to. There's therefore a logical argument that England should be given the same rights as Scotland and Wales and should have its own parliament for devolved matters. The second chamber could then be a Senate representing all the nations of the United Kingdom. Along with that kind of reform, I think we should have a radical reordering of what Parliament does. I think it spends far too much time passing laws and not enough time scrutinising government policy. It's welcome that the long-term trend on the number of acts of Parliament passed each year is actually slightly downwards, but on average they're getting bigger, more pages to each act, and there's countless statutory instruments as well. And I really do think we have to ask, therefore, isn't there simply too much legislation? More time also ought to be given to private members' bills, which are usually not whipped along party lines, because they give an opportunity for Parliament to address, often on a more cross-party basis, issues responding to and representing public opinion. I think local government too needs fundamental reform. Britain has a great talent for muddling through with muddy compromise. But our local council arrangements have become an incomprehensible mishmash of elected mayors, single-tier authorities and two-tier authorities, all arguably excessively controlled by an over-centralised state. I've long resented the fact that Reading, Swindon and Milton Keynes have been judged capable of running their own affairs with a single-tier authority, while similarly sized Oxford is not. I would favour reducing the number of councils with single-tier authorities across the country. And what's more, I have to say, I think the jury is out on whether suborning local councils to elected mayors has really done anything to improve the efficiency or democracy of local government. Those problems go alongside another really pressing national challenge, that our procedures on infrastructural investment are simply not fit for purpose. Project after project has been subject to unacceptable indecision, delay and cost overruns. Faced with global competition in which the quality of infrastructure really makes a difference, this is really damaging. The Institute for Government has highlighted how important projects from the Heathrow Third Runway and HS2 to the Thames Tideway Tunnel and Hinkley Point C Power Station have lacked effective project management and control of costs and risks. We really do need a proper national infrastructure strategy, more careful planning in the early stages, the highest calibre management and cost control, and I would argue time limits on decision taking and funding for objectives. And that way we might achieve more timely decisions within a framework of balanced consideration of public opinion to determine the public interest on which projects go ahead and to get those which do go ahead moving more quickly. This is actually part of a wider responsibility which no government can escape. That is being the sovereign purchaser on behalf of the public of countless goods and services from bridges to bullets. Procurement really is mission critical. There are dedicated public servants out there doing this work, but they are often, too often, outmanoeuvred by private sector companies who can pay top dollar for the very best negotiators, lawyers and accountants. Cost overruns on public sector projects are notorious. Defence procurement under successive governments has wasted billions, with a £2.5 billion overspend on the UK's 2 aircraft carriers alone. This really does have to be sorted out with the most able and best paid people, advised by those with a real business record, operating as a central government procurement hub and spreading best practice through public agencies and local government. And in this, there are a couple of things to be avoided. One is obvious and one not so obvious. It's very important not to become too dependent on any single supplier. When I was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, we were carrying through a huge IT modernisation programme. we were dependent for a lot of it on a single major US supplier. And as the work programme periodically slipped, the permanent secretary and I would invite a senior executive over from the US to berate them. And we always, of course, had assurances. Don't worry, we can get it back on schedule. We'll put our best people on it. And after that, lo and behold, we did see some improvement. But then we would hear from colleagues in the Ministry of Defence that their IT work was starting to fall behind. Because, of course, some of the best people had been taken from them and put onto us. The other thing to be avoided in procurement sounds paradoxical. It is to avoid too much enthusiasm. The problem with too much enthusiasm in government is that it starts skewing the evaluations of a project in favour of its going ahead, especially if the Prime Minister is the chief enthusiast. Examples are legion, and the HS2 rail project is one of them, but the best example is probably the 2002 plan to digitalise the NHS. Now, my friends in the current government have announced something similar, so they need to be careful. The predicted cost of the Blair government project was £2.3 billion over 3 years. In 2011, the project was deemed unworkable and abandoned after expenditure of an astonishing £12.7 billion. The problem was that ministers were convinced it made sense and wanted to believe the estimates and the timelines they were given. Then, as those were missed, they were ready to be persuaded that just a little bit more money, a little bit more time would get things fixed, and of course they didn't. The tragedy is that with the £12.7 billion wasted, the government could instead have built tens of thousands of houses for people in need, or indeed transformed the efficacy of UK cancer treatment. Now, in contrast, there was a much more mundane IT project undertaken by the government in that period. The old system of paying pensions with pension books at the post office was coming to an end. There had to be a new card, a digital solution, and I was appointed to chair a cabinet committee to oversee it. And this was one of those projects where success would get little coverage, but failure would be headline national news. There can't be any worse headlines, really, than pensioners can't get their cash out of the post office. So a distinguishing feature of this committee and the project was that no one was really too keen on it. Succeed and they wouldn't get much credit, fail and they'd all be hauled over the coals. So everyone round the table wondered about the post office's ability to deliver and questioned it, questioned the IT systems they were putting in place. Every step along the way was questioned, every risk was explored. The post office proposals were tested. Everything went very carefully and cautiously. Then, I think it was on April the 1st, 2003, the first pensioners presented their cards at the post office counters and got their money. An innovation born of scepticism actually worked. Now, there's lots more I could talk about, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I just want to flag 2 other issues which, from my experience, I think are crucial. One is the importance of free speech in our democracy. It's shocking in the 21st century that a teacher has to be hidden away with a new identity and probably lifelong protection because his teaching offended some Islamic fundamentalists. It's a chilling reminder that the victories of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, which when I was studying history with Frank, we too easily thought were behind us with a definitive settlement, have to be fought each and every day, and it's a responsibility none of us can duck. The same goes for the excesses of wokery and cancel culture. That J.K. Rowling has to campaign in the face of death threats to safeguard the rights of biological women is an indictment of how easily our supposedly tolerant and rational society can allow the extreme assertion of some people's beliefs to suffocate public debate. If we are to safeguard democracy, difficult controversies around competing rights, beliefs and interests need respectful discourse where honestly held views can be expressed and evidence adduced rather than attempts to shut down argument by suppressing disagreement. The second and last issue I'll touch on, and it would disappoint you if I didn't, as next Chief Secretary to the Treasury, is the importance of tackling the mounting public debt. In the UK, presently over £2.75 trillion, nearly £40,000 per head of population. When I was Chief Secretary a quarter of a century ago, it was around 1/3 of GDP and falling as we actually ran a surplus on the current budget. It's now over 100% of GDP and rising. It means that the cost of servicing that debt at more than £100 billion a year is more, for example, than expenditure on education. Managing this downwards is going to be a huge challenge. It needs a very careful balance of increasing sustainable growth through effective investment, improving the efficiency of current spending, raising productivity, training people for the right skills, and controlling the welfare budget. There isn't much room for manoeuvre. And the dangers of being blown off course by higher inflation, higher interest rates, instability in the wider world, or heaven forbid another crisis like the 2007 financial crash or COVID, are not insignificant. But at the same time, fiscal consolidation itself can bring its own dangers in damaging growth and provoking political reaction to austerity. So a very careful balancing act is in prospect, and it's going to depend for success on this country securing better economic competitiveness. And this will prove a challenge for Social Democrats at one and the same time to improve the efficiency of public spending and carry through environmental transition whilst keeping the support of working class voters. The problem is that, relatively speaking, richer people see most of the benefits of globalisation, whilst poorer people see more of the costs. The former benefit most from cheaper labour through immigration, whilst the latter suffer more the effects of competition for jobs and housing. So, and it's the same actually with measures for net zero. Higher income people can more easily afford electric cars, pellet boilers, solar panels, payment of congestion charges. But for those on lower incomes, they feel these changes chipping away at their standard of living on every side like a conspiracy against them and their families. So progress on the environment and the handling of the free movement of goods, and to an extent people too, will depend on robust action, some transfer payments and fair taxation to prevent a populist revolt which derails the whole process. Better education and training too will be essential to equip many of our fellow citizens to have a higher standard of living. So there is a lot to do. Those are my thoughts. I'm very conscious of how fortunate I've been to have a rewarding life in politics. As you heard, the honour for 30 years of representing a city of global renown in the Mother of Parliaments, a constituency and a local Labour Party gifted with such talent that I could find advice on anything very close to home. 7 years in government, 5 years in the cabinet, in a government which made a difference, serving as Chief Secretary when we actually balanced the books, getting pension credit up and running, overseeing huge reductions in pensioner and children's poverty and helping lots of young and long-term unemployed people into jobs, thinking through how to set up the Pension Protection Fund, which has saved the occupational pensions now of more than 300,000 people and has assets of 33 billion. As you heard, bringing in legislation for the advancement of the rights and opportunities for disabled people. And I would add enjoying the loyalty of so many constituents, especially in Blackbird Leys and other Oxford estates, and helping thousands of them and other constituents with pressing problems. But I finish with this. In politics, as in life more generally, none of us is an island. I owe lots of people, and this school too, for the good fortune I have enjoyed. I've had great friends and colleagues across the years, and I had the immeasurable benefit of a loving wife who was an inspiration, a wonderful person, and a talented local representative in her own right. So I wish you all well for your lives ahead. Be ambitious, work hard, be kind, think for yourselves, and learn from history. I hope some of my remarks will stick with you and help you. I hope Frank might have given this talk a tick. In these difficult times, we all need inspiration, and that's what Frank's history teaching gave me and so many others. Thank you, Frank. Learning from history, we better face the future. Thank you.
Well, Andrew, thank you so very, very much indeed.